Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you a wrap-up that, even though it's late by most people's standards, I'm not actually calling it a catch-up wrap-up. This is me trying to get back to my regular wrap-up schedule, so that I no longer am building up the months that I have to catch up for my catch-up wrap-ups. I'm ending it. I'm doing my March wrap-up today. And I know you're thinking, maybe Kelsey, like, it's the beginning of May, this is a month late. But actually, I never post my wrap-ups right at the beginning of the next month. My goal is usually to post a monthly wrap-up by the end of the next month. So, like, I missed my deadline by a bit, but like only by a bit. So I am calling this my on-time March wrap-up. And then the months that I still have to do catch-ups for are going to be December, January, February. But I will no longer let myself get further behind by letting new months go unwrapped up. So March was a month for me of reading mostly short, easy things. The first I listened to on audiobook. I have the audiobook CD here. This is Willa of the Wood by Robert Beatty. So I had the audiobook CD case in my thumbnail, but I am going to put the full cover there so you can see it. I started reading this around the beginning of February, which was around the time my mother passed away, because I often go to middle grade when I'm having stuff going on in my life that makes reading very heavy, serious adult books hard for me. But then I also had the realization after I started this book that, like, oh, middle grade has like a ton of dead parents. Maybe middle grade is not my solution to this one. The main character of this book, Willa, is an orphan. Her parents are dead sometime before the start of the book, so I thought that it might be all right. But she's raised by her grandmother, and then, like, around the time that her grandmother is, like, viciously, brutally killed, I sort of had a nope, this was a bad idea, but I kept pushing on with it anyways because it was nice to have an audiobook to listen to. But there is a good deal about grief in this book, both when Willa loses her grandmother, and also another major character who has lost his wife and thinks that his two children are probably also dead. And it is a major theme of the book, and I think the fact that it is handled pretty well was what made it hard for me and wrong for me at the time I read it. I think, and I'll talk about this with a book later in this wrap-up, there are ways that, like, character deaths can be handled poorly, where, like, the grief isn't really explored in a really honest way that I found myself to be, like, totally fine with because it didn't hit on those emotional chords. So it's not really a critique of the quality of this book that I think it handled grief pretty well. It was just wrong book, wrong time. This is a historical fantasy that takes place in the Great Smoky Mountains, which are in the southeast of the United States. But the main character, Willa, lives in the mountains, but she's not human. She is one of a people called the Faeries, who are basically like the magical inhabitants of the land. And they have a fundamentally contentious relationship with the various groups of humans that live in the area, whom they call the Day Folk. The Day Folk who used to live in this area were mostly Cherokee, but then the homesteaders moved in, and those are, you know, the white settlers who have started up their own towns and settlements. And then later in the book it becomes important that there are loggers who are coming in to log the forest, whose sort of corporate interests are antagonistic to everyone, the Faeries, the Cherokee, and the homesteaders all. But there's also a struggle within Willa's Faeries clan because they have been, for a while now, ruled by someone called the Parisien, who has brought their clan in a very different direction. They no longer honor the old ways, the, you know, ways of the forest and the talking with animals and wood magic and so forth. The people have lost their ability to forage for food on their own, and so the Parisien has really consolidated power so that he is like the sole god of the clan. There have been recently very few children born in the clan. Willa is possibly the youngest, and she is one of the only children who has any living relatives. She was raised by her grandmother, who has taught her the ways of the woodcraft magic and all of the old traditional ways that are being lost. But the few children that the clan has left have all been sort of forced by the Parisien to become thieves for him, going out and stealing from the day folk. And his motives for all of this are very, very mysterious. You know, there's intrigue, and we have revelations later, and so on and so forth. But basically, one night, Willa is caught during a daring, escapade to try to steal stuff from a homesteader house. The man whose house she has snuck into, tries to shoot her, but he seems to have mistaken her for someone else, and when he realizes that she's not what he thought she was, he seems to be remorseful. But Willa escapes, feeling all conflicted, and seeks some help from her animal friends in the forest. And there are so many threads of things going on in this story. There is a lot of stuff going on with Willa and the clan, with her relationship with, her magical heritage and the wood and, nature and the sort of environmental messages, and then her relationship with this homesteader man whom she eventually goes back to and befriends. The thing that I felt was a little odd with this book is that you could kind of feel the author's desire to write a very, colors of the whimsy nature story about, the North American land and living in harmony with the land and whatever. But because he's a white dude writing this story, he couldn't, cast the Native Americans as the magic people. So he made up, a whole extra species of magic people to live in North America. So it feels very blatantly like the author is trying to sidestep the pitfalls of writing bad Native American representation by inserting these completely made-up Fairies. And there are a few Cherokee characters in this book. I'm actually trying to think, are there? There are a couple of children who are mixed race. And then there's their Cherokee mother who is dead, but we hear a good deal about her. There's a little bit of Cherokee mythology that's used near the beginning of the book, but I don't think so much as the book went on. Mostly it's about the internal politics of the Fairies, and then Willa's relationship with the homesteader man Nathaniel as they sort of process their respective griefs together and exchange worldviews, and then the threat of the loggers. I think this might be meant to be the first book in a series. It ends at a place that, the story arc works fine as a standalone, but there were some threads of things that I think were sort of seeded in here that are probably meant to be picked up in later books. So I gave this 3 stars. It was kind of the wrong book at the wrong time, but I still appreciated it. I enjoyed it as much as I could. There were definitely things that I think I would have really loved if I'd read this as a kid, like all of the, talking to animals and communing with nature stuff. There is an appeal to children in that I definitely recognize. The narration of the audiobook was by Emily Rankin, and I thought that, the pacing of it was really weird for, the first couple chapters, but then a little ways in, I felt like she really got her footing, and then for the rest of the book, the narration felt really strong to me. So the next thing I read was the first of 2 novellas, because I determined after Willa of the Wood that reading short stuff was going to work better for me than reading middle grade. This is The Haunting of Tramcar 015 by P. Djèlí Clark, which is a paranormal steampunk mystery set in an alternate 19th century Cairo. It's the same world as his short story, A Dead Djinn in Cairo, which is available for free online. I will link it because I really liked that short story. I think the best things about this novella are, 1, the world that it takes place in, which I will go into some detail about, and 2, the way it sort of opens up this world to the possibility of more stories. This could potentially become a longer series now. But the mystery itself in this and the two main characters weren't all that special for me. So back to the world. Basically, the premise here is that there was an event that took place where someone in Egypt managed to open a sort of interdimensional portal to whatever other world the jinn and other magical creatures live in, and so now there are a lot of jinn and other magical creatures who live in our world. And because this happened in Egypt, they were able to overthrow European colonization and become a major world power centered in Cairo, which has become this very modern city. Basically, the steampunk technology in this has all been enabled by magic. So for example, there are sentient AI automatons that have been created with jinn magic. They're referred to as boilerplate eunuchs. And the Tram system in this book is also powered by jinn magic of a sort. And this alternate non-Eurocentric steampunk vision is just so cool, and it's really thought through in a lot of interesting ways, and I enjoy it a lot. So this story then focuses on two characters who are agents for the ministry that sort of polices supernatural activity, and they have been called in to investigate and exorcise a haunted tramcar. I like all of the different ideas that are in this, from like artificial intelligence and what are the rights of artificially intelligent machines, to women's suffrage. There's a suffragist movement happening in Cairo that sort of this story ends up centering around a bit. But I wasn't fond of the sort of partner dynamic of the two main characters, Hamed and Ansi. The main point of view character is Hamed, who is, the older sort of grumpy agent who's not that happy to have been paired up with this younger, wide-eyed, enthusiastic partner. And I think that's sort of like a character trope that I've seen before, and I'm just never really fond of it. I would always sort of rather see the story from the younger, wide-eyed character's point of view who is learning all of the things about how stuff works. And it's also really predictable because you know that the story arc is going to be about the older character realizing that it's not so bad to be working with the younger character after all. Who knew? And given that that story arc was really predictable between the two characters, I also don't think it was super well fleshed out. There are some references throughout to Agent Fatima, who is the main character of A Dead Djinn in Cairo, who is like the super cool agent who's off doing all of these awesome things while these blokes are stuck doing, boring cases. And honestly, I would also kind of rather be reading about Agent Fatima, who is this very non-conventional woman who defies all the stereotypes and again, gets to solve all the cool cases. Also, I sort of thought that Hamed didn't seem to know as much as I would have expected him to know, given that he is like the senior agent with supposedly a whole bunch of experience. The mystery itself was alright. It started out very predictable. There was a lot in the sort of opening pages where the case is being laid out to them and funding issues come up that seemed very, very predictable, but then it got a whole lot more fun as it went on. And I feel like this book really does open the possibility for a whole lot more supernatural mysteries set in this world, and it would be fun if we get them. I gave this 3 stars. And then continuing the 3-star streak, the next thing I finished was Robots vs. Fairies, which is an anthology edited by Dominik Parisien and Navah Wolfe. The same duo of editors also did the Starlit Wood anthology of fairy tale retellings, which I read last year and really enjoyed. And this has a considerably zanier premise, which is also a lot of fun. I think one of the best things that I enjoyed about this the most was the sort of setup of the Robots versus Fairies theme and how it played out through the book. Basically, in the introduction, the editors acknowledge that robots and fairies are both vastly superior to humans, and so we must prepare to welcome our overlords, whichever they may be. And so each of the authors in the collection has been asked to pick a team, either Team Robot or Team Fairy, and their story should in some way illuminate how great fairies or robots are, and why they are inevitable overlords. And the stories in here pretty much, for the most part, alternate between Team Fairy and Team Robot. I think for story order's sake, there was one point where there were 2 robot stories in a row, but mostly they alternate. And then at the end, each author gets a little chance to write about why they are on Team Robot or Team Fairy, and also how that admiration informed the story that they chose to tell. And while some of the stories are really just fairy stories or just robot stories, I enjoyed seeing how many, not all, but many of the stories chose to use storytelling elements traditional to both types in order to tell whatever robot or fairy story that they were going for. So I started this book when I did because I had just a few days left for Hugo nominations and I was short on short stories. And I thought, here's an entire book I have of short stories published in 2018. How long can it take to find me a couple that I really want to nominate because I like them that much? And I was surprised that while I was getting things out of every story I was reading, it took me a long time before I found something that I really liked enough to put on the Hugo ballot, which was, when I got there, it was Just Another Love Song by Cat Howard, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stories in. And Just Another Love Song was really quite short. It's a modern fairy story about a woman who is a banshee and is using her magical singing talents as a street musician, but hasn't really chosen to use the darker side of that talent to cause harm until a guy shows up who is just so much of a jerk and also magical, and he keeps pestering her to sing him a love song. And it is basically the story about how she gets her banshee vengeance on the jerk music dude. It's great. I think the other story I probably would have liked to nominate if I'd gotten to it in time, but I didn't, was the very last story, which was A Fall Counts Anywhere by Catherine M. Valenti, which is the story that takes most literally the idea of robots versus fairies, and it posits this big, like, throwdown spectacle match between the robots and the fairies. And while it is technically a Team Fairy story because the fairies technically win in the end, the idea is that the robots and the fairies are maybe similar enough that they should really team up to overthrow the humans who are forcing them to pit themselves against each other. And then I think my other favorite was probably the first story that I kept reading past it to see if I found anything I liked better, and that was Seanan McGuire's story, Build Me a Wonderland, because it very specifically speaks to a sort of love of Disney-like theme parks. It's about a theme park that started out with, like, fancy electronics, and then slowly the actual magical fae folk who have been hired to work there are converting it over to real magic. So it has the elements of robotics in it as well, while it's firmly Team Fairy. You may notice that most of my favorites, all of my favorites from this collection really, are Team Fairy stories, which is not surprising for me given that I really like fairy stories. I was, however, hoping to like some of the robot stories more than I did, and there were plenty of stories on both sides here that I found intellectually interesting, but just weren't, like, standout stories for me. I think there was only one story in here that I really actively disliked, and that was All the Time We've Left to Spend by Alyssa Wong, which was just an incredibly creepy and sort of psychologically disturbing robot story about, like, the dead members of this girl band who all died in this horrific accident, whose memories have been used to, like, recreate artificial intelligence versions of themselves. It was very sort of disorientingly upsetting for me. But pretty much all of the others were interesting, but not super incredible for me. I'm just gonna go through them in order and see what I've got to say. So Quality Time by Ken Liu, I think, is actually novelette length, and I was excited to learn that because I was looking for novelettes to nominate for the Hugos, but it just didn't make a huge impact on me. It did do a bit of a crossover, engaging with fantasy, mythology, folklore themes in a sci-fi story thing, because we're following a mythology major who gets her first job at a robotics company, and her journey of rising within the company with some ideas that ultimately have downsides that she doesn't foresee. Murmured Under the Moon by Tim Pratt was about a mortal librarian of a fairy library, so I feel like I should have loved it. It just ended up being pretty forgettable for me. The Blue Fairies Manifesto by Annalee Newitz is a robot story, despite having the blue fairy in the title and it being based on Pinocchio to an extent. It's one of two stories in here that are inspired by Pinocchio, both of which are robot stories. It's about a factory robot called Real Boy who works in a toy factory, and a drone of the Blue Fairy that comes and forces some liberating code upon the Real Boy to try to convince him to join the robot uprising, and this conflict about whether or not he should have had a choice in what the Blue Fairy did to him. This was a good story for me, but I felt like I'd read better from Annalee Newitz. Specifically, I'd recently read When Robot and Crow Saved East St. Louis, which I thought was a better short story by Newitz. Next, Bread and Milk and Salt by Sarah Gailey, which is a fairy story that sort of in reverse I thought was better than Stet, which was the Gailey story that ended up getting nominated for the Hugos, but it still wasn't quite one of my favorites. It is this sort of dark, twisty fairy story told from the perspective of this fairy who keeps visiting this boy in different forms, and eventually how dark that relationship ends up turning out to be. I think this one has been reprinted online, so if I can find it, I will link it. Ironheart by Jonathan Mayberry, I have basically forgotten. Give me a second to figure out what this story was. Oh, this story was really depressing. This is about a man who has an artificial heart, and he's very ill and he's dying. He's a war veteran, and like the VA paid for his surgery but aren't continuing to pay for the medications he needs, and his family is a farming family and they're running out of money, and the farm robots are all running down. It was sad. Sound and Fury by Mary Robinette Kowal was it felt like a kind of classic sci-fi adventure story in which a team of technicians are helping with this diplomatic mission that involves sending this this giant robot to this planet to be like the giant robotic surrogate diplomat, and things go badly, and there are also sort of ethical concerns about the fact that basically the inhabitants of this planet are going to be sort of tricked into joining this political union of some sort that's basically just going to exploit them for their resources. But it had very enjoyable characters, including, I think if I remember correctly, one who looked kind of like a fairy, although they were definitely an alien. They were described as sort of looking like a fairy. I'm not pointing out all of the sort of crossover between robots and fairies that are happening in some of these stories, but there are quite a few. The Bookcase Expedition by Jeffrey Ford is a fairy story that didn't make much sense to me. Like, I don't know if there was something there for me to get. Basically, the main character is a guy, at least I think he's a guy, who is ill and has started to see these itty-bitty fairy folk around his house, and he's basically just watching these small fairy folk trying for some reason to, like, climb his bookcase. Basically, I just felt like there wasn't much to this story unless there was something I was missing, and there might have been something I was missing. The only other thing I've read by Jeffrey Ford was his story in The Starlit Wood, and that was one of my less favorite stories in that collection too. Shadow Work by Madeline Ashby is about a robot who is essentially an elder care assistant to an elderly woman who is basically a witch, in that she's a spiritual, magical leader in the community with a large online following. Whether or not any of the magic is real is sort of open to interpretation, but this is, a future where it seems like other organized religion has maybe fallen apart, but she fundamentally doesn't believe that her robot assistant has a soul, and it's sort of about the relationship between the two. I feel like there were things I wanted to say about this that I've forgotten. Yeah, I remember being struck a bit by her author's note on this one, about how basically whether or not you consider someone else to be human is kind of a social contract, and how accepting one another's humanity is essentially always a leap of faith. Second to the Left and Straight On by Jim C. Hines is a Peter Pan thing. It's like a gritty, modern, missing child thing where, Tinkerbell has been angrily abducting children into her cult in an attempt to find Peter Pan. And it's about a woman who offers her services to a family whose daughter has gone missing because she thinks Tinkerbell has kidnapped this girl, and the main character herself has this past that gets revealed. I didn't love it. It didn't work that well for me. The Buried Giant by Lavi Tidhar is the second of the Pinocchio stories, and it's really, it's strange and interesting. It's post-apocalyptic. It's told to us through a framing device where a narrator talks about how he and a friend of his, when they were children, heard this story told to them about this boy named Ollie who grows up in this fake, ideal, perfect human city, of what the idyllic, suburban life was before the world fell apart, except that it is all artificial, and it's the, robotic presence trying to make this perfect childhood for him. So when he discovers that he is in fact different from the people around him who are all robots, he feels that he must not be a real boy, because everyone else he knows is robots. And then he goes off and leaves the ideal community to go on a quest of sorts. And he meets some other characters along the way, some other robot characters who are also based on characters from Pinocchio. Three robots experience objects left behind from the era of humans for the first time by John Scalzi is very short, and it's kind of just like a little gimmick. It's written just with dialogue in these little vignettes of these three robots trying to figure out human things, basically. This one was actually adapted in the Netflix series Love, Death, and Robots, which is an anthology series, as just three robots. It was one of the few episodes I watched of that show before giving up on it. This was alright. There were some decent jokes, but there wasn't more to it than that. Ostentation of Peacocks by Delilah S. Dawson, writing as Lila Bowen, is set in the world of a series of hers that I haven't read. It's about a character who appears to be a shapeshifter of some sort named Nettie Lonesome, who I guess might be the main character of the series, who resumes human form for a time in order to face down some magical bad guys who can't tell that she is also magical. It's a weird Western setting, and again, it was just all right. There seem to be some things going on with the main character's gender identity. Nettie is a character who is referred to in this story as she, but she seems actively uncomfortable with being a woman and doesn't have any sort of resolution or development in that regard within this story, which is sort of just a snapshot. So I don't know what that character's journey is throughout the broader arc of the series, but that is sort of what's going on in this one. There were two sort of Shakespeare retellings back to back towards the end, which were Adriftica by Maria Devana Headley, which is a fairy story, and To a Cloven Pine by Max Gladstone, which is technically a robot story. So Adriftica is based on A Midsummer Night's Dream and the idea that because the fairy king and queen are having this custody battle over this child, the whole balance of the world is out of whack and the place is becoming uninhabitable, climate change to the extreme, etc., sort of based on the "these are the forgeries of jealousy" speech, which sort of describes the seasons being wrong and floods and disaster because the fairy king and queen are fighting. And in this story, it's very much made to be the custody over their child, not some changeling that Titania took from the mortal world, but their child in the split, in their divorce. And the narrator of this story is essentially the Nick Bottom character. But this story, I think, treats him a lot more sympathetically than the play does, in which Nick Bottom is basically the butt of a joke. Basically, in this, he's sort of the hapless mortal who has found himself sort of in above his head, married to a woman who is way more than she appears to be. And, like, he knows that there's something more than mortal going on with her and with their son, but he can't quite wrap his mind around it. And then he starts he's like a music journalist, and he starts writing about this band that are headed by the character who we learn is Oberon looking for his wife. This was interesting. I enjoyed the sort of twist on the story. And then To a Cloven Pine is a very convoluted sci-fi Tempest thing. I read this story and then thought that I would probably need to reread it if I really wanted to understand it, and I didn't, so I don't really understand it. But basically this is a Tempest scenario where the island is really probably a spaceship, and then Ariel and Caliban are AI characters who are somehow stuck in this story of them living on this island with, you know, the magician and his daughter, but, like, they're not really real and they have to break out of that story. It's a mind bender, that one. And then I think I've talked about all of them. So this was Robots vs. Fairies, and I gave it 3 stars. There were plenty of stories that I found interesting, but not as many that I loved as The Starlit Wood, and I think the ones that I loved a little less. And then the next thing I read was another novella that I read for the BookTube SFF Award read-alongs. This one was Beneath the Sugar Sky by Seanan McGuire, which is the 3rd book in the Wayward Children series. I got a digital copy of this from the library via Overdrive. And then March was the month that the read-along for this was happening, and then I read it for the read-along, but I think I forgot to go back and comment in the group because I'm bad at remembering to go back and comment in group threads on read-along books that I read. So this one is an actual sequel to Every Heart a Doorway, following a number of the same characters with events that happen because of things that happen in the first book, whereas the second book, Down Among the Sticks and Bones, was a prequel following a couple of the characters from the first book. And then I think the next book after this, In an Absent Dream, is also a prequel. So you need to read Every Heart a Doorway in order to pick up Beneath the Sugar Sky, but you don't need to read Down Among the Sticks and Bones. This is a series following characters who are students at one point or another at Eleanor West's School for Wayward Children, which is a boarding school for children who have gone to portal fantasy worlds and have come back and are looking for their doors back to that fantasy world where they truly belonged. This is the first book in the series to include both scenes at the school and in some of these portal worlds. In fact, we visit not one but two different portal worlds in this book that were referenced in the first one, but we never actually went there. Basically what happens in this one is that a girl shows up at the school from the candy world of confection in order to ask for help. Her conundrum that she needs help with is loosely spoilery for book one, but I do want to talk about it. Rinny is the daughter of Sumi, who is one of the students at the school who died in book one. She was prophesied to go back and save the world of confection when she was all grown up, and because confection seems to be one of those worlds where time works slightly differently from ours, that has happened, and only now is the fact that Sumi doesn't actually exist anymore catching up with confection, and everything that has happened since her return is at risk of unhappening. Rinny herself is starting to disappear, and the tyrant that Sumi overthrew is back on the throne. And so we have a bunch of characters, old and new, who end up on a quest to basically bring Sumi back from the dead. This is where I want to sort of tie in my thread from way at the beginning of the video about like how when death and grief were dealt with in a very serious, earnest way in Willa of the Wood, I couldn't quite handle it. But in this book, it didn't matter to me, and I think that's because those subjects in this book are really plot points. They're not dealt with any sort of emotional depth. And if I were reading this at some other time, I might find fault with that and like dock points from this book and its rating for that reason. But for me reading this in March, it actually made it super readable for me in a way that other things weren't necessarily proving super readable. Rinny's relationship with her mother really doesn't feature, and the bigger implications of death and resurrection aren't really dealt with in great detail either. It really all is a sort of plot point to stop the timey-wimey stuff that is magically threatening confection. And I did really enjoy reading about confection itself. It's one of those like wildly whimsical fantasy worlds where like everything is made out of weird stuff, in this case like candy, that I always enjoy to read about. It reminds me quite a bit of Catherine M. Valenti's Fairyland. I think I've mentioned the Fairyland books as a point of comparison for these before. In the first book, I thought it dealt with a lot of the same portal fantasy themes as The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making, but didn't do it with as wonderfully whimsical a writing style. It was very straightforward, to the point. Book 2, the prequel Down Among the Sticks and Bones, did use that sort of elevated narrator voice writing style that I really enjoy, and that's part of why I liked Book 2 better than Book 1. And then this book, Book 3, has the world building that you see in it that reminds me some of that Fairyland world building. But like the first book, it's told in that more straightforward contemporary narrative style. I wonder if the more storyteller voice is something that Seanan McGuire is like specifically reserving for the prequel books in this series. I haven't read In an Absent Dream yet though, so I can't be certain. As for the characters, this did something that I think Book 1 also did that I found annoying when I read Every Heart a Doorway, which is that the main point of view character, the sort of lens through which we're seeing the story, is a character who doesn't necessarily play a major role in the plot, who isn't really a major player in the story. In the first book, it was Nancy, who was a new student at the school. In this one, we have another newer student at the school, Cora. Cora is a girl who's been bullied for a lot of her life for being fat, even though she's not unhealthy. It's her natural body type. She's very athletic, and she went to an underwater world where she was a mermaid. And we see her sort of befriending these characters, some of whom we know from Book 1, and experiencing what it's like to be accepted by them. She sort of expects going to a world like confection to be teased for being the fat girl in a world made of candy, but she isn't. And we see the sort of positive effect that experiencing that acceptance has on her. That said, it really isn't Cora's story. And by the end, I still felt like I needed a book about Cora. But when I read Every Heart a Doorway, I don't think it was announced that this was going to be a long series. I think maybe the second book might have been announced, but there was no way to know that it wasn't just going to be like a book and its prequel. And seeing how this book brings back recurring characters like Cade and Christopher, both of whom we got to know a little more in this one. Specifically, I think we got to know Christopher a good deal better in this book than we did in the first one. I liked him more here. We also saw Nancy again from book one. But seeing how the structure of this series does bring characters back makes me feel less like I want to see a full character's entire story arc in one novella. I can leave this story confident that we probably will see more of Cora and that this isn't the end of her story. So I think I've been won over. I think I'm on board with this series, and I gave Beneath the Sugar Sky 4 stars. And then the last thing I read was very short. It was a volume of manga. It was The Girl from the Other Side, Shularun, Volume 4 by Nagabe. And this is a series that I'm enjoying. I've spoken about it several times before. Oh, maybe when I read each of the first 3 volumes. Again, I'm going to show you that I really like the art style in here that's very dark and atmospheric. But there are also, throughout the series, a lot of really lovely, charming domestic scenes, even though it's overall very spooky, kind of creepy fantasy story. I like the balance that this strikes. This volume was one that had more of that domestic setting and less of the high-stakes danger that, like, volume 3 had some pretty dramatic stuff happen. But we learn a little more in this one about the main character Shiva's backstory, this little girl, and why she might be special. I feel like we're maybe starting to get some answers, although there's a whole lot more to learn about this world. This is about a world that's divided between the outside and the inside. The outside is inhabited by these cursed beings, and the curse spreads via touch. We learn a little bit more about the curse in this volume too. And the humans are incredibly paranoid about the curse, and the outside has been sort of gradually taking over human settlements that have to be abandoned. Shiva, however, is a human girl who lives on the outside with this guy whom she refers to as teacher, who is taking care of her. Their relationship is lovely. In this, it is tested a bit by the arrival of another character who inserts herself into that relationship dynamic. And I thought we got some lovely character scenes in this one. I gave it 4 stars. I think it's probably one of my favorite individual volumes so far, but I've given them all 4 stars across the board. And that's it. That's my wrap up for March. Here are some of the things I've read. Let me know if you've read these. Let me know what you think. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.